All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the book of Genesis. In this recording, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, all the way down through chapter 9, verse 29. And this section is the well-known story of Noah and the ark, Noah's ark. And at this point in the story of the Bible, sin and death have permeated the earth, have filled the human heart. In fact, the verses right before this section are the catalyst. They give the reason for the flood. Let me read Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 and 6, because they really are the springboard into this story. So it says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of mankind was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. So the Lord was sorry," or as we explained in our last recording, the Lord took an account of all of this because he had made mankind on the earth, and he was grieved, and he set out to make things right. And so that's the impetus for the story about the flood and the flood itself. This is actually what the Apostle Paul is reflecting on when he writes in Romans chapter 5, verse 12, "Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, so death spread to all men, because everybody sinned, all sinned." So sin runs so deep that the intent, and every thought of the human will is affected by it. And so the sin that began in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve has proliferated now outside of the garden, bringing chaos and brokenness and disorder to the earth. And so now God responds by, in a lot of ways, returning the earth to chaos as a means of judgment and also in an effort to cleanse it. One note on structure before we look at a few details out of this section is that this section is framed by mention of Noah and his three sons. So you get Noah and his three sons in chapter 6, verse 9, and then towards the end of the section in 9:18 through 29, we also get Noah and his three sons. And the other thing to notice is that by the end of the section, the original creation has been destroyed, cleansed by a flood. And so we're kind of on the cusp of almost like a new beginning. And so as we come to the end of the section, be sure that you pay attention to echoes back to Genesis chapter 1 and the creation of the world, and particularly the creation of human beings. So let's pick up in Genesis chapter 6, verse 9. Humans have made a mess, and God, because he created humans, sets out to clean up the mess, clean up the earth. It begins like this with a reference once again to the idea of that toledot structure that we've mentioned in the book of Genesis. So chapter 6, verse 9 says, "These are the records, the toledot of the generations of Noah." Every time we see that in Genesis, what we get is not just the person whose name, the generations of Noah, we actually get their descendants. And so we're going to get Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, mentioned immediately after that. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. That's an important phrase. He's not just completely blameless, but compared to others in his generation, he stood out as righteous and blameless. Noah walked with God. We already saw in chapter 5 in that genealogy how walking with God is crucial to the problem that has infected humans and has affected the earth. So Noah walked with God. And Noah fathered three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so begins this toledot structure, this story about Noah's sons and Noah's family. And it picks up like this in verse 11. "Now the earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for humanity had corrupted its way upon the earth." Do you hear the repetition of the word corrupted? When God had originally created the world, right, it was good. He pronounced it good. We heard that repetition of it being good. Well, now God looks and he doesn't see goodness. He sees corruption. It was corrupt. God looked and it was corrupt. Behold, humanity had corrupted its way on the earth, and it was filled with violence. So things have gone completely awry on God's good world. Then God said to Noah, The end, that is the goal, the purpose of humanity has come before me. For the earth, to restate, is filled with violence because of the people. So behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. He's going to use means of the earth to destroy the violence and the people on the earth. And that word destroy actually comes from the same root word as corrupt in verses 11 and 12. So they like corruption. They've chosen corruption. Well, God says, I will give them corruption. And what he's going to do in sending the flood is to bring chaos and disorder full scale into the world. They've chosen chaos and disorder. I'm going to give them chaos and disorder. And so God gives instructions to Noah in verse 14, make for yourself an ark of gopher wood. You shall make the ark with compartments, like stalls, picture that for animals, and cover it inside and out with pitch. It needs to be seaworthy and watertight. So he's going to make an ark. And the only other place this word for ark is used in the Old Testament is for the basket that Moses was placed in and set in the Nile River. So when we come to that story on the commentary, we'll need to look back here because it seems Moses is linking them together with that word. And then God tells him how big you're to make the ark. He begins to give instructions for the design of the ark. This is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Now, a cubit is roughly 18 inches. It referred to the distance from the elbow to the tip of the fingers, roughly 18 inches. And so the ark is approximately 450 feet by 75 feet by 45 feet. So a large boat, the largest boat known in the ancient world from the description given here. And then God gives more instructions for the ark in verses 16 down through the end. He tells them to make the ark with a window towards the top and put some door on the side of the ark. He tells them to make decks on the ark. So he gives more instructions for the ark. And then he says, behold, I'm bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh. Here's the purpose for the ark. Now, in which there is the breath of life. I'm going to destroy them from under heaven. Everything that's on the earth shall perish, but I will establish my covenant with you. You shall enter the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your son's wife. So Noah and his whole family are going to be preserved, and God's going to make a covenant with them. And we will hear at the end of this story some details of the covenant God makes coming out of the flood story. And then famously, God tells Noah to bring all the animals in pairs, 2 by 2, male and female, onto the ark. Why? Because he intends to preserve both humans through Noah and his family, and he intends to preserve the animals, and hence there needs to be pairs, male and female, so they can reproduce afterwards. He even tells Noah in verse 21 to take food for yourself, giving them very specific instructions. Take food that you can eat while you're on the ark. You're going to be there a while, and we'll see how long that's going to be in a little bit. Gather some food, store it up so you have some food for yourself. Verse 22 is important. So Noah did these things according to everything that God had commanded. Noah did them. That's important. We'll actually see that same sort of idea restated here very shortly, and it emphasizes Noah's willingness to obey God and to listen to God. That's what makes him stand out in his generation. Chapter 7, verse 1 then says, Then the Lord said to Noah, Enter the ark, and all your household, for you alone have I seen to be righteous before me in this generation. Noah is willing to listen to God. He's righteous in his generation, so he's going to be the one God is going to use to preserve human life and animal life on the earth. Then what we're given is a little detail in chapter 7, verse 2 and 3 that's really important. It's not just that the animals come in 2 by 2 in pairs. Most animals do that, but verse 2 and 3 tell us that there's also some clean and unclean animals. And so clean animals you bring in not just in sets of 2, but you're going to bring in 7 pairs. So there's going to be 14 clean animals. You shall take with you 7 pairs of every clean animal, a male and his female, and 2 of the animals that are not clean, a male and a female. So you get 7 pairs of clean animals and only 1 pair of unclean animals. And this distinction here with clean and unclean, we don't have the full clean and unclean teachings of the law of Moses. It's going to come later in the book of Exodus. But nevertheless, this still seems to have to do with animals that are appropriate for sacrifice in some way, because prior to the flood, humans only ate fruits and vegetables. They didn't eat animals. And so this isn't wanting clean animals for eating. This is clean animals for sacrificing after the flood. So God gives Noah instructions for that. For after 7 more days, God tells Noah, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, and I will wipe out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. So again, God restates the intent. I'm going to send this flood. We're going to wipe everything out. So Noah, verse 5, acted in accordance with everything the Lord commanded him. Noah is obedient to God. And God actually purposes to preserve animal life and human life, and he's going to do it through Noah and his family, and Noah faithfully followed God's instruction. Now, we're going to have to summarize some things in this story because how large of a chunk it is. So chapter 7, verses 6 through 16, we're told how Noah and his family entered the ark and how God shut the door behind them, and then the rains began to come. We're also given a couple other important details in chapter 7, 6 through 16 that we need to make sure we notice. The first is we're told exactly how old Noah is when the flood happened. He's 600 years old, and we're actually told it's the 2nd month of his 600th year of life. That's important because at the end of the flood story, Moses will restate the length of time that they were in the ark in terms of Noah's age. So we have to pay attention to that here. Noah is 600 years and 2 months old when the flood happens. We're also told, another important detail, that it wasn't just rains that caused the flood, but the fountains of the deep burst open too. So water pouring out of the fountains of the deep as well as pouring from the heavens. And then in verses 17 through 24, we're informed that this happened for 40 straight days. The waters continued to rise for 40 days, so much so all the mountains were covered. And Moses actually, once again, here in verses 17 through 24, restates the aim of the flood in verse 23. He says, so he, God, wiped out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from mankind to animals to crawling things, even to birds of the sky. They were wiped out from the earth. Only Noah was left together with those with him in the ark, his family and the animals that were with him. And then we get this little detail right at the end of chapter 7 in verse 24. The water prevailed upon the earth for 150 days. The point of that little detail is that whereas the rains and the fountains of the deep caused the water to rise for 40 days, the water did not begin to subside for 150 days, 5 whole months. But then chapter 8 opens like this, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the animals and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to subside. Now, the point isn't that God had forgotten Noah, got busy with other things in heaven and forgotten Noah and the ark and all of a sudden remembered him. That's not the point. The point is when it says God remembered Noah is that God is faithful to his promises. And even though 150 days had passed, God kept Noah in mind, and now he begins to bring an end to the water prevailing. So we're told how the water began to subside and then how long it took. Verse 2, the fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were closed. The rain from the sky was restrained. The water receded steadily from the earth. And at the end of 150 days, the water had significantly decreased. Then, we get the chronology. In the 7th month, so they've been in the ark for 7 months. The ark rested finally after 7 months on the mountains of Ararat, and the water decreased steadily until the 10th month. So another 3 more months, and in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains finally began to peek out from above the floodwaters. So the floodwaters were so high and so great that it took that long, another 4 or 5 months from the time the water began to subside until the tops of the mountains became visible. And here's how the time on the ark came to an end, beginning in chapter 8, verse 6. Then it came about that at the end of 40 days, so after 40 more days, another almost a month and a half, so now we're in the 11th month, Noah opened the window of the ark, which he had made, as God had told him, and he sent out a raven, and it flew here and there until the water was dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water was low on the surface of the land. But the dove found no resting place for the sole of its foot. So it came back to the ark, for the water was still on the surface of the earth. So he put out his hand, took the dove back, brought it into the ark to himself, waited another week, 7 more days. He sent the dove out again from the ark. The dove came to him in the evening, and behold, now in its beak was a fresh olive leaf. So Noah knew that the water was finally low on the earth. Plants were beginning to grow again. Then he waited 1 more week longer, sent the dove out again, and this time it did not return to him. And so now, at this point, finally, after all this time, the earth is at a point where it seems to be like, okay, things are drying up, things are beginning to grow, we can go back out on the earth. And so Moses gives us a bit of a summary to restate the chronology, the length of time that they've been in the ark, this time in different terms, specifically in relation to Noah's age. So it came about in the 601st year of Noah's life. Remember, this started in the 600th year in the 2nd month. Well, now it's the 601st year in the 1st month, on the 1st of the month that the water was dried up from the earth. Then Noah removed the covering from the ark, looked, and behold, the surface of the ground had dried up. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. A whole year later. A whole year in the ark. Then God said to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you, and bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and animals and every crawling thing that crawls on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." And so just as God had told Noah to go into the ark and shut the door behind him, now God gives him instructions to go out of the ark. And that reminds us that really, even though we refer to the story as Noah's ark, God is the main character in the story. God is the one giving the instructions. God is the one shutting him into the ark and calling him to come out of the ark. And Noah is merely righteously obeying God in response to him. Also, it's important to notice here at the end of this, when they're called to come out of the ark, that we hear an echo of Genesis chapter 1 in the creation account, right? Be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out, and his sons and his wives and his sons' wives with him. Every animal, every crawling thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out by their families from the ark. And so they all now emerge from the ark that they've been on for a year. And in response, Noah built an altar to the Lord, took some of every kind of the clean animals. Remember, there's 7 pairs of them. So he took some of the clean animals, some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar to the Lord, basically to express his gratitude for being preserved from this flood. The Lord smelled the soothing aroma, and the Lord said to himself, "I will never again curse the ground on account of man, for the intent of man's heart is evil from his youth." That's just the way it's going to be. That seems to be the force of what God says. It's like, I'm not going to do this again. I don't think this is going to be the solution ultimately, long-term, to the problem of the human heart. I will never again destroy every living thing as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. In other words, God is promising to preserve the earth and its seasons and its daily cycle in his faithfulness to the world that he's made. And so God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, once again, hear the echo of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the terror of you will be on every animal of the earth and on every bird of the sky and on everything that crawls on the ground and of all the fish of the sea. They're handed over to you. Every moving thing that is alive shall now be food for you. I have given everything to you, just as I have given the green plant. And so it seems that this is a shift in the relationship between humans and animals. Now, humans will begin to eat animals for food. But you shall not eat flesh with its life in it. That is, its blood. That'll be important, and that'll be restated in the law of Moses as well. So you have to make sure when you butcher an animal, you drain its blood out of it. I certainly will require your lifeblood. From every animal I will require it, and from every person, and from every man as his brother, I will require the life of a person. What is he talking about? Well, verse 6 clarifies. Whoever sheds human blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God he made mankind. And so humans are going to be held accountable for killing other humans, and God is saying that one of the ways that's going to show up is if somebody is a murderer, then the penalty is going to be death, because humans are made in the image of God. And we need to recall that violence filling the earth was described as a key reason for the flood, a key part of the corruption that led to it. And so God now is at the end of this moment saying, we need to find a way to put a limit on humans killing humans. And then once again recognize the echo of Genesis 1. So be fruitful and multiply, populate the earth abundantly, and multiply in it. And so Noah and his family is called to fulfill this part of the human vocation once again of multiplying and populating the earth. And then God makes a covenant with Noah, the first explicit covenant with human beings in the Bible. It says this in chapter 9, verse 8. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, Now, behold, I myself am establishing my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the livestock, and every animal on the earth with you. All that comes out of the ark, every animal of the earth, I establish my covenant with you, and all flesh shall never again be eliminated by the waters of a flood, nor shall there again be a flood to destroy the earth. So God, as we noted at the outset of this, God's going to make his covenant with Noah. Well, here's part of that covenant. And part of it is that God's not going to destroy the earth by flood again. God's not going to eliminate life by the waters of a flood again. There will never be a flood as judgment over the whole earth like there was in this case that wipes out every living thing. And then as God continues to describe his covenant with Noah in verses 12 through 17, God describes how the rainbow will be a sign of that covenant. That here is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I have set my rainbow in the cloud. It shall serve as a sign of the covenant. And so the rainbow becomes this reminder that God's not going to destroy the world by flood again. And then we wrap up this little story by coming back around to the mention by name of Noah's sons. Now, the sons of Noah who came out of the ark with him were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, Ham was the father of Canaan. That'll be important because of who the Canaanites become later in the biblical story. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was populated. And then after that little kind of note there, the episode of the flood actually ends with a strange little story about Noah and drunkenness. Why is this little story here, and what's significant in the narrative? It's not here by accident, so what's it doing here? Well, we have noticed throughout this little section at the end of the flood account, the echoes back to Genesis chapter 1, multiplying, filling the earth, hearkening back to the creation account and the purpose of human beings there. Well, in view of those parallels, the author of the Tyndale commentary on Genesis writes this about this little episode that I think is helpful for us. So before we read this episode, I want you to have this in mind because I think it clarifies what's the point and purpose of this little episode. This last narrative about Noah, the Tyndale commentary writes, is not simply a strange story about drunkenness and his son's actions. It is that, but it's more than that. Instead, it prepares the reader for the next stage of the Genesis account of a new earth that is still beset by human sin, but also by the hope that can come only through the blessing that derives from the God of Shem, as we'll see in verse 26. Thus, a new literary pattern emerges from this point on, beginning with this story in Genesis. After each covenant given by God in Genesis, sin then will continue to be highlighted as the central problem of the human condition, even for those who receive the covenant promises. Yet, God will remain faithful to his promises and continue with his plan to redeem humans from the curse of sin and death. End quote. What he is saying is that beginning with this little episode, we get this covenant with Noah and his family, and then we get this little strange account about sin continues and corruption continues, and that becomes a literary pattern then in the rest of Genesis and elsewhere in the Bible, where it's like you get covenant and you still get sin. That these covenants are not the final solution to the problem. They're a reminder that God's going to be faithful, and someday God will ultimately redeem humans from the curse of sin and death. And so we read here in Genesis chapter 9, verse 20, this strange little story that highlights ongoing sin even after the flood. Then Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. The first little thing we need to note is that phrase began farming is actually a very loose translation and misses an important theological point that the author of Genesis is making. Literally, it says Noah was a man of the earth. Not that he began farming. Noah was a man of the earth. And the word for earth in Hebrew is Adamah. Adamah is, you can hear it, related to the word Adam. And it probably intends to remind us that though he had been saved from the judgment on the earth, Noah is still in Adam. He's still fleshly. He's still mortal and fallen. And what happens next is evidence of that. So he's a man of the earth, planted a vineyard, drank some of the wine, became drunk, uncovered himself in his tent. Ham, the father of Canaan, and the reason Moses keeps highlighting that is because of who the Canaanites are and what that means in the biblical story. So Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. Now, we don't know exactly what that means. We don't know exactly what Ham did, but what we see in the rest of this little episode is that it wasn't good. So he goes and tells his two brothers outside. His two brothers are a little more noble, apparently, than Ham. So Shem and Japheth took a garment, laid it on both their shoulders, walked backwards so they didn't uncover or see the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned away so they didn't see his nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine, he knew what his youngest son had done to him. Whatever Ham had done, it's not clear in the text, but he had done something immoral, corrupt, and wrong. And Noah knew it when he woke up. And so he said, verse 25, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." He also said, verse 26, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and may he live in the tents of Shem, and may Canaan be his servant. In other words, Canaan had done something wrong, and so Noah pronounces a curse upon him and a blessing upon Shem particularly, and Japheth as well. And the point is that Ham's family line through Canaan is now going to be cursed. Before we leave this weird little episode, we do need to note that somehow in the course of human history, this curse on Ham was used to justify the American experience of slavery. And this just illustrates a faithless reading of the Bible rather than a faithful reading of the Bible. There's nothing here to indicate that Canaan's family line will be black Africans. There's nothing in this passage that indicates that's why they should be servants and slaves. In fact, the entire narrative from Genesis through Deuteronomy shows that Canaan are actually Semitic peoples living in the Middle East. And so using this text, actually misusing this text to justify slavery as it was in the American South, is a faithless reading of Scripture, reading it for our own purposes, rather than listening to Scripture to hear what it actually says. And that is tragic and unfortunate. So after this little episode, we hear Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Just as that refrain in the genealogy of chapter 5, we now culminate that with, once again, Noah lived 950 years and he died. Yes, he was spared the flood, but no, the problem in sin and death is not solved in and through Noah. So let's just wrap up the story of the flood with a few theological reflections. First, this story is about God rectifying a bad situation. That's fundamentally what the story is about. It's actually presented as an uncreation and a recreation, and that's the reason you get the echoes back to Genesis chapter 1 at the end of this. Through the flood, the earth descends back into the watery chaos, just like in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Then it reemerges to start fresh. And the focus is fundamentally on God, not so much Noah. Yes, Noah is the main human character in this story, but God is the main actor and the one who is controlling and dominating the narrative. So it's a story about God rectifying the corruption and violence of the human situation. The second reflection is that this story shows us God's righteousness in action, that God's righteousness both judges and delivers. In this story, all flesh is condemned, but Noah and his family and the animals are saved. And after referencing the Noah story, the Apostle Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2 says this: "The Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trial and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment." And that's how God's righteousness works. It both delivers as well as condemns. And so when we talk about God's righteousness, and we hear that all over the place in the Psalms and in the prophets, and we hear it in places like Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 3, what we recognize is God's righteousness is God's action to judge people and the world and to deliver his faithful ones, just like he delivered Noah and his family. And then at the end of the flood story here in Genesis, God promises never to destroy the world by flooding again. So how will God deal with human sinfulness, with sin and death and corruption that's ruining God's good world? Well, as we keep reading Genesis, we'll see that God promises how he plans to do it. And it turns out to be a long saga that culminates in Jesus, who is the very embodiment of God's righteousness. He's the ultimate means by which God will rectify the problem of human wickedness. He is the ultimate bringer of a new creation. Once again, the Apostle Peter pulls all of this together. So he writes in 1 Peter chapter 3, "For Christ also suffered for sins once for all time, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God, having been put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the Spirit, in which he also went and made proclamation to the spirits in prison who were once disobedient when the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. And corresponding to that now, baptism saves you, not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who is at the right hand of God, having gone into heaven, after angels and authorities and powers had been subjected to him. And so just as God demonstrated his righteousness in and through Noah, it points forward to Christ in the fact that Jesus is the bringer of the ultimate righteousness of God. He is the ultimate restorer of creation. And someday, through his resurrection, he's going to make all things new. And there will be a new heavens and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the book of Genesis. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that is only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for giving your support to this ministry so that it can continue to grow and increase. And if you want to join the team of supporters, easiest way to do that is to go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, where you can set up a one-time or a recurring monthly donation. All monthly donors get access to the Study Hub with some bonus material and some online courses from me as well. Thanks a ton for your support.